for the main event, we are here to talk about Hollywood names and stories. We're going to start with talking about what Hollywood was like back then, just to kind of give us a baseline, so we're all on the same page here. So first off, you may have noticed that there was a much larger volume of films being produced back in the day. And a big part of that is that it was definitely quantity over quality. So they had the movies on the ABC listing for a lot of them. So a lot of studios would have their B movies, which were the steady ones that would get things, the A movies that they really threw everything at. And then there were the C movies where they were just like, well, we have to have something in the theater. And a large part of that was that, this is before the days of TV, and people were going out to the cinema, and the studios wanted to keep making money. So if you ever look at, the filmography of some of these actors, you'll see that they were making 3 to 12 movies a year, depending on who they were and what kind of parts they were playing. So when you hear some of the numbers for some of these movies coming up, when I start telling you, oh, they were in this many movies, they were largely in like a really short block of time. The other thing to note is that this was the day of studio contracts. So if you're not familiar, back in the early days of Hollywood, the actors were signed to a specific studio. So if they were signed with MGM, they were only making movies with MGM. And part of that was that they had very little choice in what movies they were making with MGM. You took what you were told because your contract said so. And a big part of these contracts also had to do with very much appearances and the publicity. They were in charge of the publicity for all of their stars. And so what that resulted in for a lot of them was having to maintain an image that wasn't necessarily who they were. Part of that, of course, is the names, which we'll get a little bit to here. But being owned by a studio meant that you could be loaned out against your will to another studio, especially if you made someone mad, or if the price was high enough. A lot of times they would trade actors. So MGM really wanted this actor, but they were with Paramount, and Paramount kind of liked that actor, so they would trade them for films. You were all under their umbrella. You didn't have very much say-so in it. The actors were told kind of what image to present. So this can be as simple as their hair color. They weren't, especially with women, weren't allowed to dye their hair. A lot of the men had toupees. And then they were also forced into sort of like relationships that were usually the fake relationships. And a lot of this was for their appearance. They would have the lesser known actress paired with a really well-known actor, and it was beneficial for sort of both of their careers, but primarily the actress to kind of get that notoriety, that little bump of attention from the paparazzi, because of course the studios would set up these dates. They would be sitting there in a booth surrounded by 12 different photographers. It was not natural at all. And most notable for this one would be like Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. They never dated. It was a whole studio scheme. But there were even some things that could be outside of what we think a contract should have allowed. Like women were told they were not allowed to be pregnant or they would be dropped. A lot of the actresses would adopt. So Joan Crawford famously had adoptions. I mean, we're not going to go into Mommy Dearest right now, but there were other actresses who hid their pregnancies and then pretended to adopt their own child just because the studio would have dropped them if they had found out. There were women who were told they were not allowed to get married because they were all sex appeal. And if you were married, men wouldn't want to go see your movies. So all of this was because of the morality clauses listed in these contracts. So that's just our baseline here. So now we're going to talk about some name changes. And I encourage you to tell me if you know who they are. I feel like I'm starting a little easy for us though. So there we go. Like I said, I had to start easy. This is, So we're going to start here with Norma Jean Mortensen, also known as Norma Jean Baker. You might have heard that. This is, of course, Marilyn Monroe. She was also known as Jean Norman when she started her modeling career. That was the name that she took for herself. As I said, you probably had heard of her as being Baker at times. That was because her mother was first married to a man named Baker. She was married to Martin Mortensen at the time of Marilyn's birth. However, this is new information, at least new to me when I started researching this. In 2022, they found out that her father was actually Charles Stanley Gifford, who was a co-worker of Gladys's. So that was news to me. Is that news to everyone? Yeah. I feel like that should have been like, it was probably like a little line in People magazine or something. But they did DNA testing and discovered this. So just interesting. She began modeling early after being discovered by a photographer who was taking photos at a World War II factory that she was working in, and started using that pseudonym of Jean Norman when she began her modeling career. She started modeling in 1945, and by 1946, she had already been signed with an acting agency. And so who named her would be Ben Lyon of 20th Century Fox. They chose her name to name her after Marilyn Miller, who was a Broadway star at the time. And a lot of this would be kind of using names that the public had responded to favorably in the past, so using the name Marilyn. But then they also used her mother's maiden name, Monroe, because the alliterative effect kept it in your head. And they modeled her to look like the actress Jean Harlow, pictured there. So you definitely see that influence in her looks, because she was not naturally a blonde, as I'm sure you know. And then this is the Marilyn that we all know and picture. So, like I said, that one you knew. All right, so how about Marion Robert Mortensen? John Wayne. There we go. Yeah. I tried to find young pictures because it throws you off the scent. So this would be John Wayne. So Marion Robert Mortensen, he began appearing in movies first in 1926. He was legally named Marion Robert Mortensen, however, or Morrison, I'm sorry, I said Mortensen after Marilyn. Marion Robert Morrison. He was also, his family informally, not legally, changed his name to Marion Michael Morrison after his brother Robert was born. They gave the name to him instead. You may also have heard him referred to as Duke or the Duke, and that is another one of his aliases that we'll get to here. He never legally changed his name, and family and friends all called him Marion. He went by John in the studios and things, but never changed his name. The nickname Duke actually came from a childhood nickname. He was called Little Duke by a local fireman who would see him out with his little dog Duke, and they never went anywhere. They always went everywhere together. And he started calling little Marion Little Duke. And that nickname sort of stuck around and followed him, and obviously became something that he became known for, being called the Duke later. One thing that I found interesting too is that he did apply for the Navy, but his grades were bad. He wound up going to USC on a football scholarship, and then he actually lost that scholarship when he broke his collarbone. He didn't want to tell his coach because he knew he'd be mad at him, but he lost that, and he was too old by the time the U.S. entered World War II for him to actually join in and enlist. He was 34 at that time, and actually carried a lot of guilt at never being able to serve his country because he had tried and failed to do so himself. In 1930, he was given his first starring role, and the studio determined that he needed a new name. So who named him? The Fox Film Corporation. He had zero say in his name. He came to work one day and was told, "This is your name now." So they decided they wanted to give him a name that evoked strength and made you think of like a powerful man, and they wanted to call him Anthony Wayne after a Revolutionary War general. But then they decided that Anthony was just too Italian, and they didn't want to evoke that image, so they decided that John was a good solid name and called him John Wayne. He was not at all consulted in that name change, as I said, and he actually started out working in the scenery and things at the studio, and then was given a chance when they thought he might have had a little star power. He claimed that he modeled his famous walk and talk after Wyatt Earp, who I'm sure you've heard of, who he was acquainted with through a mutual acquaintance. So he kind of used that. Yeah. All right, so the next one I think is a little harder, but I don't know. You guys are good with the faces. Lucille Fay LeSueur. No? Joan Crawford, yes. So Joan Crawford was born Lucille Fay LeSueur and nicknamed Billy. Her father left the family before she was 1, but her mother was married 3 different times. And her stepfather, Henry Casson, she thought was her biological father for most of her childhood until one of her siblings sort of broke her the news. But he ran an opera house, which exposed her to acting and music and dance from a very young age. And she became very interested in dance herself and started training. However, her training was interrupted when she jumped off the porch and landed badly on a broken milk jug. It caused such injury to her foot that she was not only unable to dance for about 1.5 years, she also was pulled out of school for it. She missed about 1.5 years of schooling and dance lessons, and this time, combined with later working as a working student at a school, meant that she never really got beyond a primary school education. After her mother split from Henry Casson, her family did not have much money, and so in order for her to stay at the school, they said she had to be a working student, which meant she did sort of odd jobs at the school and thus had a lot less time to focus on her studies. She did briefly try to attend college and felt very overwhelmed, realized it wasn't quite for her, but she did all right without it, right? She did become a dancer and was dancing on the chorus in a traveling revue in Detroit when she was discovered and sent to New York to do some screen tests that ultimately then led her to Hollywood. When she started making films, she went under the name Lucille Lesueur, which you think kind of follows that whole, the name sounding, the LL thing, but they decided at MGM that since she started to take off, she was no longer just a background girl, she needed a better name. And Louis B. Mayer, who I'm assuming we've heard of, famously said that her name reminded him of the word sewer, and nobody wants to go see a movie with a sewer in it. So this is where hers is a very interesting one. So who named her Joan Crawford? It was a contest. There was a contest put in Movie Weekly magazine, not with Joan's okay, in order to name the star. And the winning name was actually Joan Arden, and then the studio found out there was another Joan Arden. So they couldn't do that, and the runner-up was Crawford. Now, Joan famously hated this name, but as I said, she was owned by that studio and just kind of had to do what they said. And if they won't put her in a movie unless she's Joan Crawford, well, she's going to be Joan Crawford. But she tried to get her acquaintances to call her Joanne. She tried to make changes to it. She hated the name Crawford because it made her think of crawfish. I wouldn't have made that connection right away, but it did to her. And she actually did have to push her way into Hollywood after these initial things, because there was a time, which if you have any familiarity with Joan Crawford, she was being sort of cast in these nothing roles, and she really had to force her way into Hollywood. And one of the things that was impressive about her, and not to be said for all of the actresses of the time, is that she really did seamlessly go from the silent films to the talkies and stuck around for quite a while. And as I said, she was one of those ones with the adoptions. We know she's the mommy dearest, so that's a different story. All right, so let's try our next one. So, Joseph Ewell Jr. Oh, man. You're good. It is Mickey Rooney.
No wonder you didn't give us a picture, because from the time he was little to the time he was...
Yep. So he appeared in more than 300 films. So he was in silent films and worked in movies and television for nearly 9 decades, and he was married 8 times. I give you the incomparable Mickey Rooney. So he was Joseph Ewell Jr., also known as Mickey McGuire and Mickey Ewell. He was born to a chorus girl, burlesque dancer mother, and his father was a Scottish-born vaudevillian, which was the early comedy theater. And so they were already sort of stage parents right from the get-go. At age 4, his parents divorced, and his mother moved him to Hollywood. She found the first roles that he had through newspaper advertisements. not so uncommon back then, which is how he became Mickey McGuire. So at the age of 6, he started working in films and made 78 short films as Mickey McGuire, and adopted that name while he was encompassing that role. Mickey McGuire was based on a character from a popular comic strip of the time, and that became a problem. We'll get into that in a second here. But he did take on this role just at age 6 and just kept going until he was about 12. At 16, he became Andy Hardy. I keep wanting to say Andy Rooney. Andy Hardy, which we know him from the Hardy films, where he also started working with Judy Garland, who, by the way, was born Ethel Gum. She's not in this one, but I just feel the need to mention that. They made a number of musicals together. Their publicists kind of forced them to be dating, but they were very close, but never actually dated. All the photos of them kissing and things like that were staged, or for the movies themselves. So they were linked romantically, they were out and about together, but they were very good friends. His first wife was actually Ava Gardner before she was anyone, and she was 18. They were married like a year. He did get married 8 times, had 9 kids and a bunch of grandkids. But so where did Mickey Rooney come from? So as I said, he went by the name Mickey McGuire. Well, he wanted to go on tour, and when they weren't filming and, you know, put on little acts as Mickey McGuire. I say he was very young at the time. It was probably his mom. But so they wanted to go on tour with that, and they were actually there was a major lawsuit from the comic strip because this was their name, and they didn't give him permission to use it. He briefly did legally change his name to that, though. His mother even commissioned to change her last name to be McGuire, and the studio actually lost that fight, and Mickey and his mother were told they were not allowed to use the name McGuire anymore. So briefly in there, Mickey Yule, which was his normal last name, and then they decided that he needed a name with more like star power, and so his mother had actually suggested the last name Looney because he's comic. But, you know, you want to avoid a fight with the Warner Brothers cartoons. So they just changed one letter and liked the sound of it, and he became Mickey Rooney. All right, so how about this one? Izur Danielovich.
Douglas.
Oh, you were good.
It looks
Yeah, that is Kirk Douglas. See, again, I tried to find the young picture. Throws you off. But you got it.
That's still his chin.
I know, right? It's hard to hide that. So this is Kirk Douglas. He also went by Izzy Dembski. His parents were immigrants from Russia and modern-day Belarus. His uncle, who had moved here before them, started to go by the name Dembski, so the family did adopt that as their name after a little while. So he was Izzy Dembski, Izzy being short for Izur. And they changed it to Dembski because they thought it was easier for people to pronounce. Growing up in this immigrant household, he only spoke Yiddish as his first language. He had 6 sisters, which is too many. And he felt very responsible for them because their father was an alcoholic, and from a very young age, Kirk was out trying to make ends meet, getting whatever money he could to help his family, his mother and his sisters. But he did decide at a very young age that he wanted to be an actor. And he was about 5 years old and performed a speech in class that really inspired him. And he went to St. Lawrence University and then went to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. So I think he's the only one I have in here who really did a lot of the studying to get to that. But when he was at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, he became very good friends with Betty Jean Persky. Does anyone know that one? Lauren Bacall. So Betty Jean was his good friend and actually helped him get his first movie role in 1946, which was after the war because he did enlist in World War II. Goodness, wrong timeline. He enlisted in the military in 1941, and at that time, that is when his name changed. He changed his name, changing it to Kirk Douglas. There's not a great amount of detail as to why he chose the name he did, but he changed it because he felt that the name was too Jewish for Hollywood and too Jewish for him to get far in the military. He later regretted this. In later life, he had a near-death accident where he then really embraced his Jewish faith and sort of regretted changing his name and not embracing who he was more. But he did pass this name on to his actor son, Michael Douglas, who used it for the association to his father when getting started. All right. How about Ruby Catherine Stevens?
Barbara Stanwyck.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it looks just like her. Very pretty.
So Barbara Stanwyck, she has a bit of a sad story too. A lot of them have a sad start, it seems. She was orphaned at age 4. Her mother passed away after complications from a miscarriage, and her father had gone to work on the Panama Canal and never came back. Presumed dead, unfortunately, which happened to a number of men who had gone to work on this enormous project. Her sister Mildred had actually, oh wait, I gotta put her name up there. There you go. Her sister Mildred had actually taken custody of her and her brother, but she was also fairly young and she worked as a showgirl. And so in the times that she was touring, the siblings were put into foster homes. This is also a thing that I find unusual about this time period, is that there's a few different people where they put them into an orphanage or a foster home for a short period and then got them back, and did that a few times. Apparently they let you do that back then. At the age of 9 and 10, Barbara was able to accompany her sister on tour, where she would watch from backstage and copy the dances and, learn from her sister, and became enamored with that lifestyle. At the age of 14, she dropped out of school, and she shortly began working for the Ziegfeld Follies. Is everyone familiar with the Ziegfeld Follies? Okay, yes, okay. So, singing, dancing, comedy. They were the Ziegfeld Girls. So she was one of the Ziegfeld Girls in 1922. This picture, by the way, is at 17. At 19, she was cast in her first play, and that was because they wanted to put a real dancer in the play. They decided that they weren't getting enough from the actors who were trying to do it, but they needed someone who actually did this for a living. And so she was cast in this play, which initially did not do great on Broadway, but then they sort of tweaked it and gave her part more speaking roles, more depth to her character in the play, and it became a huge success. And after that is when she changed her name and became a big Broadway star with the play Burlesque. That helped her land her first role in a movie at age 20. And she was married at that time to someone who was a blip on her radar eventually, but she moved with him out to Hollywood and became quite the success she was, with 85 films and a lot of television appearances as well. So who named her Barbara Stanwyck? This was David Belasco, who was a theater producer. He wanted her to change her name for the stage to give her more substance, because apparently Ruby wasn't good enough. But they chose Barbara because a play in the early 1900s that had been quite popular was Barbara Frietchie. And then they used the name Stanwyck, who was the lead actress in that play, Jane Stanwyck. This one has been substantiated because they found a playbill from the 1906 production that showed Jane Stanwyck in the lead role of that play. But it's almost to me like some of these were picked by, like, let's grab whatever's around and find the first name. But very interesting. And she, as I said, so many movies. All right, this one I feel like you're gonna know too, just because the picture, but I'm gonna say it first. Bernard Schwartz.
Tony Curtist.
Oh, good. Because I feel like his face gives it away, makes it real easy. So Bernard Schwartz was born to Jewish immigrants from Hungary. Also Anthony Curtis, short for that. But he only spoke Hungarian until the age of 6, which is when he started school, which was a little late already. But his father was a tailor, and the family was quite poor, living behind the shop in essentially just the one room. At one point, he and his brother were sent to an orphanage for a short period of time because the parents could not feed them. He and his brother were quite close, and after his brother did die, he joined a street gang at age 10 in New York, which at this point was more minor crimes, kids getting into trouble, lots of pickpocketing and, taking things from the five and dime, that kind of thing. But a neighbor actually sort of took pity on him and sent him to a Boy Scout camp at age 11, which he credits with helping get him on the straight and narrow. They paid for it and everything, which is super nice. And after Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the Navy, and he was a big fan of movies and enlisted specifically in the Navy in the Pacific because he was a fan of the Cary Grant movie Destination Tokyo. Not the greatest reason to make a life decision, but it worked. When he was 23, he had been discharged and he moved to Hollywood, where he dated Marilyn Monroe before either of them were famous at all. And he was in the most recent Marilyn Monroe biopic thing. He was a character in it. So when he made it to Hollywood, he was under the contract with Universal Pictures. And Universal Pictures, he renamed himself because he felt like he was not going to get far with a name that had such Eastern European undertones and sounded quite Jewish, as his family had been, and he knew he would never become a star with that. He chose the name Anthony Curtist, and Anthony was because there was a novel he enjoyed called Anthony Adverse, and Curtist he figured was still sort of a variation of the last name Kurtz, which was on his mother's side, one that had been anglicized as Curtis. So he had that same sort of connection with it, similar to how Marilyn Monroe still kept like her mother's name. All right, the next one I also feel like the picture gives away, so I'm going to say Jane Alice Peters.
We're stumped.
Okay, that's good. No?
Carol Lombard.
Carol Lombard, yes. See, I feel like their face is very distinct to me. So Jane Alice Peters, she was born to a very wealthy family in Indiana. Both her parents had come from money, and she refers to her early years as her silver spoon years because that's when her parents were able to just spoil the heck out of her. But when her parents separated, her mother moved her and her siblings out to Los Angeles, where she excelled in sports and was actually discovered by playing baseball at age 12 by someone who saw her and thought that her tomboy looks would be appealing in his silent film. She was cast in that role, and her mother were both just so pleased with that experience, they decided to continue to pursue acting for her. And at age 16, she was signed with Fox and abandoned her schooling, such as it was. She started off being a really popular actor for them in little bit parts, and they wanted her to become a leading lady very quickly. So this is still in the early days of Hollywood here. But at age 17, she was a leading lady in her first movie. At 19, at sort of the height of her fame, she was actually in a bad car accident where it almost ended her career because the windshield shattered and scarred her face. She underwent a number of reconstructive surgeries in order to try to sort of get her look back. They actually sued the driver of the car and I think got about $3,000, which back then was a good amount, because of the fact that they said she had been out of work for so long due to this. And they had asked for more than that because they kind of did, here's her weekly salary, and tried to do that. But after all of that, she found ways to get back into the movies and make her grand return by careful makeup, careful lighting, knowing her angles, those kind of things that helped so that you didn't see the scars that she still remained. So who named her Carol Lombard? When she was first approached to sign for a studio, one of the main conditions was that they wanted her to change her name. So she had decided she was going to be Carol Peters initially, and then that studio had backed out of that contract. But the studio that did pick her up said, well, yes, you need to pick a different name because Jane Alice Peters is just too average. Everyone has that name. There's a reason it's plain Jane kind of thing. They didn't want her to use that name at all. They liked Carol, Carol with an E, notably, and that had been the name of one of her tennis partners as a child, and Lombard was the name of a family friend that they wound up giving her for it. So this is after the accident. I don't see any scars. They did a good job. All right. And she died an early death in a tragic plane accident, returning after being on a war bond trip where they were trying to promote war bonds for World War II. At the time, she was married to Clark Gable. But despite that early death, she made more than 50 films in her time and is still very well remembered. All right, Margarita Carmen Cancino. You're good. You know your stuff. This is Rita Hayworth.
Really?
Rita Hayworth, who was basically born dancing. Her mother had been in the Ziegfeld Follies, and her father's family from Spain was super well known in the dance community. Her grandfather was known worldwide as a great dance instructor. Her father had started different instructions in New York, and then later when they moved to Hollywood. And he himself performed regularly, so she was born dancing. At age 3, she started lessons, and by the time she was 12, she was her father's dance partner. So this picture here is approximately 12, 13-year-old Rita. Her parents moved her to Hollywood because her father sensed that dancing was going to take off more in movies. And I mean, he was right. There are a lot of early movies with some great dance sequences, and her father, he was on the ground floor with that. And he actually trained a number of Hollywood actors in different dance performances and helped to choreograph things. But at age 12, she became her father's dance partner, and they were the Dancing Cancinos, except she was only 12 and legally not supposed to work in the state of California. So her father booked them shows just over the border in Tijuana. That is where they performed, and that is where she was discovered. So in Tijuana, it was a very popular destination for people in the Southern California region. So they would go out for dinner and dancing and things like that. And so she was there with him in order to help sell their product, if you will. Her father actually dyed her hair black. It was a lighter brown in order to make her appear more Spanish. At 16, she had been contracted with Fox under the name Rita Cancino. During this time, they put her in a number of bit parts for ethnic characters. She played characters who were Spanish, Argentinian, Russian, even Egyptian, and they were kind of grooming her to be a big role that then was given to Loretta Young when the studio heads changed. And when the studio heads changed, they looked at her and said, nah, her look doesn't work for us anymore, and her contract was terminated. But she was quickly picked up with Columbia Pictures for a 7-year contract, and that is when her name became Hayworth. With Columbia, the studio head, Harry Cohn, said her look was just too Mediterranean, and they wanted her to go through some different changes to be more marketable for them. They said she had great dancing skills, a great voice, and was an excellent actor, and they could see her going far, but they needed to make a number of changes with her. The first being her name, of course. So Rita is her name. She's Margarita. She went by Rita with her family. They decided that Hayworth, which was her mother's maiden name, her mother was Irish American, was all American for her, and that would be more welcomed by the American public. Her father was very upset about that change because he had made a name for them using that last name of the Cancinos, but ultimately that's where it went. Other changes that they wound up making for her. So this is Rita Cancino, signed by Fox. Okay, when she was with Fox, 1935 for this picture, she still had the darker hair, and she had a more, I don't know the best way to say it, pronounced hairline. That's how I'm going to go with it. And they had her at Columbia dye her hair to be a ginger red, and they had her undergo electrolysis to completely change her hairline to make her appear less ethnic and have a broader forehead. So you probably don't notice that when you're looking at her in the movies because it's not side by side. So this is 1938. So just a few years later, after she had switched studios, and they had brought her hairline up significantly in order to give her a more Americanized face, as they said, Americanized. But that was a big change. So this was my last in-depth one, but we're going to go through a few others that I have a few notes on. So some other classic name changes here. John Charles Carter. Charlton Heston. Joan de Beauvoir de Havilland. No, that is Joan Fontaine, Olivia de Havilland's sister. So they had a famous sibling rivalry, in fact. Olivia de Havilland became an actress first, and the mom really favored Olivia in life, and when Joan expressed an interest in acting, her mother told her that under no circumstances was she allowed to use the family name because it would detract from Olivia's fame. And in that vein, the two sisters were sort of forced into this rivalry. And Joan, being the younger sister, had always sort of lived in Olivia's shadow, even more so during this. But both became famous in their own right. And fun fact, they are the only siblings that have both been nominated for Academy Awards and won them. In 1942, they actually went head to head, and Joan won an Academy Award before Olivia did. Joan won the 1942 Best Actress, and in 1947, Olivia de Havilland finally won hers. And they both had very different tales of how that first night went when they were going head to head. But all right, this one I feel like you're gonna know. Archibald Leach. Yeah. See, that's why he didn't get his own page, because everyone knows that one. But I do enjoy the fact that if you've ever seen the movie His Girl Friday, he makes a comment about Archie Leach, and like that he is the last guy who insulted him in that way, and I appreciate that. All right, David Daniel Kaminsky. Oh, see, I thought people would know this one. That was Danny Kaye. Very similar. He thought his name sounded too ethnic for Hollywood. Doris Kappelhoff. Doris Day. Yeah, everyone knows that one. All right. What about Virginia Catherine McMath?
Virginia Lamb.
What's that?
Virginia Lamb.
No.
Ronald Reagan.
That is Ginger Rogers. Ginger was a nickname from childhood for Virginia, and she actually took on the name Rogers because it was her stepfather's last name. So, not as exciting of a story with that one, but that was fun. Emily Claudette Chauchon. Claudette Colbert, yes. And she just kind of took her mother's maiden name as her last name, Colbert. And initially, she was bilingual. She had been born on the French islands, I think, so she spoke French and English. And they kept typecasting her as like the French girl because she could affect the French accent very well. But also was very good at having a Midwestern accent and a British accent because she had been all these places. But so in order for her to stop getting typecast as the French girl, she would tell them her last name was Colbert and didn't want them to pronounce it with the soft T at the end. Frederick Austerlitz.
Frederick Martin.
Fred.
No.
I just figured out what it is, but I'm not going to remember.
I know. I was going to say, Jason spoiled this one on Facebook. This is Fred Astaire. And this one, interestingly, the whole family changed their name because they did not like the association of Austerlitz with the Battle of Austerlitz. So they all changed their name to Astaire. And there's unsubstantiated evidence that there had been like a relative who was L'Astaire, like L apostrophe, back down the family line, and they didn't, so they chose it that way. All right, and now this one's a fun one. William Henry Pratt. Boris Karloff.
Oh, we should have known that. We're just Tuesday.
So I find this one amusing because he thought his given name was too boring. And he wanted something that people would remember. They actually said that this name, Boris Karloff, was a variation on the character of a mad scientist from a dime store novel of the time that he took on as his own. And I love that he was like, William, that's just too boring. I'm going to go totally other direction.
You can't see him as a Bill Pratt after all his movies.
Exactly. I mean, he was like a mummy, and he was just all these crazy characters. So, all right. So you might think that this is an old trend to change their names for Hollywood, but my last slide here is going to be about some of the ones that we have today, and I want to see if you know any of these. So, Mark Sinclair, modern actor, has been in, I think, all of the Fast and Furious movies. Vin Diesel.
Really?
He changed his name to Vin?
Yep. It gave him more stage presence. Krishna Banji. That is Ben Kingsley. Mm-hmm. I feel like you're going to know this one. Carlos Irwin Estevez. No, close. You're so close.
Emilio Estevez.
Nope, you're very close. Charlie Sheen.
Oh,
Yeah, so Martin Sheen changed his name to be changed the Estevez and did the Charlie Sheen. And his two sons, Emilio Estevez and Charlie Sheen, both went into acting, but they were going in at the same time, and Charlie wanted to make sure that he was making his own way. Emilio wanted to make his own way, kept his given name for it. All right, Margarita Ibrahimov. She's married to Tom Hanks. Rita Wilson. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What was her name? How do you say
Ibrahimov. I will have to look that one up. I don't know. But, all right, so this is a fun one. This actor's real name is Michael Douglas, and he changed it because there was already a Michael Douglas.
Oh, I know this one.
Michael B. Jordan. No, but he used the B because of the other Michael Jordan. That's Michael Keaton. His last name is Douglas.
oh, for heaven's sake.
Yeah. All right, Natalie Hirschlag.
Nellie Wood.
No,
Great guess.
that's a good guess though.
More mine.
I like that you know this one, Jason.
I may have had to see the prequel Star Wars more times than I care to admit.
Carrie
Natalie Portman.
Oh, I thought it was Tom Hanks.
Natalie Portman. Yeah, it was Natalie. Mm-hmm.
Now, did they get to pick their own names?
I think most of them did. Yes, that would be the change. Most of them did get to pick their own names and, to pick their stage names going forward. All right, Olivia Cockburn. No, but that's a famous Olivia. That's a good one. Olivia Wilde. All right, Nicholas Coppola. Nicolas Cage, yeah. All right, Margaret, Mary, Emily, Ann, Hyra.
That's 6 different people. I'm not following that. That's like all of the Von Trapp kids.
It's a mouthful of a name, which is why she changed her name to something quite short. Any guesses? No. Good guess.
You said short.
Quite short, not quite. She was married to Dennis Quaid.
Wilson, I know the pretty girl.
Meg Ryan.
Yeah.
Yeah, look at that name.
That in Hollywood, thank you.
How many letters that is? All right, and then I have Winona Laura Horowitz.
Winona
Ryder. Yeah.